we'll just get right into it. So my name is Analies, and I'm Hydroviv's head of policy. And today we're going to be talking about kind of a recent emerging story about a fluorochemical manufacturer in North Carolina and the recent lawsuit regarding DuPont and Chemours, which are two of the largest names in this fluorochemical space, and PFAS, which is something that we've talked a lot about on our Instagram Live and on our blog, is kind of at the heart of these lawsuits. So we'll kind of get into it and talk about some of the legal practices that both of these companies are using to try to not be held liable for the years of contamination. So we will just kind of get right into it. And I'll start by just kind of talking about the three major reasons why we care about PFAS, these lawsuits, so much. So number one, PFAS do not break down in the environment. So that means they can travel long distances and be just as harmful as when they left the chemical plant. So number two, they're super easy to trace. So if there is a fluorochemical plant 10 miles away from a municipal source water, it's really easy to point the finger at where the PFAS pollution is coming from. And number three, people are getting sick. So we see this all across the country of different types of cancers, increased risk of miscarriage, and a lot of reproductive problems associated with people who have consumed high levels of PFAS chemicals in their drinking water. So I guess we'll just start by talking about how this issue really began in North Carolina specifically. They're kind of the epicenter of PFAS contamination in the country. So I'll start with DuPont's role. So DuPont had been producing a whole variety of PFAS chemicals at this one plant in Fayetteville, North Carolina, ever since the 1980s. So DuPont, 3M, Chemours, all of these different PFAS manufacturers had been producing hundreds of thousands of different variations over a period of like 50 years. All of these different variations had different levels of toxicity, carcinogenic properties. So toxicologists have determined that there are over 5,000 different PFAS variations present in the environment. And it's really important to point out that the disposal practices that these companies were using were not best in class. And that's really where this problem became so prevalent in North Carolina, because the Fayetteville plant had just kind of been doing the bare minimum to contain PFAS from their facility. And so those chemicals ended up getting directly into the major source water, the Cape Fear River, for dozens of surrounding communities, and it also entered groundwater. So that's pretty much how it all got started in North Carolina and how we ended up where we are today, which is two different chemical manufacturing companies suing each other. So in 2015, after years of contamination and years of producing these really harmful chemicals, DuPont recognized that it was not sustainable for them to be pelted with lawsuits and have to pay them off, and it just wasn't the trajectory that would make them profitable. So they decided in 2015 to create a spin-off company called Chemours that would be responsible for all of the PFAS and fluorochemical production, and DuPont no longer wanted to associate itself with the fluorochemical industry. So when this all went down, Chemours, the new company, had some idea of what they were getting into, but they didn't really understand the extent or the scope, and they also saw this huge upside in the fluorochemical space. So this includes things like firefighting foam, non-stick fabrics, water-resistant fabrics, and things like that. So it fluorochemicals definitely have their benefits, but they also are definitely extremely harmful when humans ingest them. So, according to this 2019 lawsuit, when Chemours finally said DuPont was not entirely transparent about the liability that this new company, Chemours, was about to incur. So they basically said that DuPont set Chemours up to be financially overwhelmed and ultimately bankrupt. So, for example, when the burden was kind of put onto Chemours, they said this one lawsuit would be no greater than $128 million. And Chemours said, all right, that's fine, we can deal with that. At the end of the lawsuit, it ended up being $671 million for that one case alone. And this was one case in Minnesota. So Chemours had no idea what they were really getting into, and that's when they ultimately decided to sue DuPont. So what kind of is going on now? What's the latest with this whole DuPont-Chemours saga? Actually, at the beginning of October of 2020, the North Carolina Attorney General decided to sue both DuPont and Chemours for everything that went down in North Carolina, in the Attorney General state, specifically pertaining to the Cape Fear River. So the Attorney General didn't put a dollar value on this lawsuit, which I thought was really interesting. In the past, when Attorney Generals or governors are suing these big corporations, they're putting a dollar value. For example, Michigan just had a $600 million lawsuit. New York, something similar. Minnesota. So typically they come up with a dollar value and then they ask for those ask for that money in damages back. The North Carolina Attorney General realized that the scope of contamination in North Carolina was so broad that he could not put a dollar value on it. So the lawsuit actually just said for all damages past, present, and future needed to investigate, remediate, and restore all natural resources in that area. So this is a really significant claim. The Attorney General is basically saying, this is all your fault and you need to fix it. And it's interesting because they included DuPont, who was no longer part of that Chemours conglomerate. They included DuPont because the North Carolina Attorney General saw and understood that DuPont was responsible for all of the contamination up to 2015. So that's basically the gist of the lawsuit from North Carolina onto the two chemical manufacturing companies. So, where do we go from here? What is the solution to this? And unfortunately, a lot of these lawsuits will end in a settlement that doesn't necessarily reflect the scope of contamination. So what we saw in Minnesota a few years ago was an $850 million settlement for PFAS contamination from another chemical manufacturing company called 3M. And since then, people have come out and said this did not cover the full scope of the contamination. So we'll likely see something like that with North Carolina. Unfortunately, not much action has been taken by the state to mitigate the current state of PFAS. Some water utility plants have added PFAS removal media into their treatment, but not all. And especially if you're on a private well, you're not necessarily covered in the actions being taken by the state or by Chemours. Chemours has decided to provide filtration for houses that are in a 9-mile vicinity, but as we know, this PFAS contamination travels much further than 9 miles. So I think that's pretty much the gist of everything that's been going on in the past year and a half with DuPont and Chemours in North Carolina. But if you have any questions, you can send us a direct message on Instagram. You can email us at hello@hydroviv.com. And we'll have this video up on our YouTube channels. Make sure to subscribe to Water Nerd TV. And yeah, thank you for watching.